Adrian Blackwell adjusted his tie in the rearview mirror, his reflection a perfect embodiment of confidence. His dark, neatly combed hair framed sharp features, and the deep navy suit he wore hugged his athletic build with precision. Tonight was a milestone, a celebration of his engagement to Natasha Gray. The streets of Manhattan glimmered under the golden hue of streetlights. Taxis honked, couples strolled along the sidewalks, and the city pulsed with its usual vibrance. But for Adrian, the world outside was little more than a blur as he steered his car toward the lavish downtown venue where Natasha had spent weeks planning their engagement party. "Everything has to be perfect, Adrian," she'd said during one of their conversations. "This isn't just about us, it's about showing everyone who we are as a couple." Natasha Gray wasn't just Adrian's fiancée, she was a powerhouse. As one of New York's most sought-after event planners, her name was synonymous with sophistication and precision. She thrived on control, on ensuring that every detail, no matter how small, fell perfectly into place. Adrian admired her ambition. He loved her drive. But he couldn't deny that sometimes the pressure to live up to her expectations felt like a weight he wasn't sure he could carry. The passenger seat held a leather-bound notebook containing a speech Adrian had been agonizing over for days. Tonight was meant to showcase their future, a union of success and shared ambition. Yet, as he navigated the bustling streets, a nagging thought tugged at him. Was this the life he truly wanted? Or was he merely playing a role in Natasha's meticulously curated vision? The venue was just a few blocks away, its grand facade glittering under the city lights. Adrian exhaled deeply, straightening his shoulders. Whatever doubts he had would have to wait. Tonight, he had a part to play. Adrian's phone buzzed on the passenger seat, Natasha's name flashing across the screen. He sighed, glancing at the traffic ahead before reluctantly answering. "Adrian," Natasha's voice came through, sharp and impatient. "Where are you? The guests are already arriving." "I'm on my way," Adrian replied, keeping his tone calm. "On your way?" she repeated, incredulous. "This isn't some casual dinner. It's our engagement party, the night everyone will be talking about. Don't ruin it by showing up late." Adrian clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening on the steering wheel. "I'll be there soon. Just breathe, Natasha." The call ended abruptly, leaving Adrian in a tense silence. He exhaled heavily, his shoulders stiff as he focused on the road. His thoughts swirled between the speech he had prepared and Natasha's mounting pressure to make the night flawless. Reaching over to the passenger seat, Adrian picked up the leather-bound notebook. It contained every word he intended to say tonight, a mix of heartfelt admiration and carefully crafted phrases that Natasha had previewed and approved. She probably rewrote half of it in her head, Adrian thought with a faint smirk. His amusement was short-lived. A loud horn blared from his left. Adrian's head snapped up just as the headlights of a delivery truck bore down on him from the intersection. Time seemed to slow. Adrian yanked the wheel to the right, his tires screeching against the asphalt. The impact was sudden and violent, the crunch of metal against metal reverberating in his ears. The world spun as his car careened into a street lamp. Glass shattered, the dashboard crumpled, and a suffocating silence followed. For a moment, Adrian lay motionless, the acrid smell of gasoline and smoke filling the air. Pain radiated through his body, but his mind felt detached, floating somewhere between consciousness and oblivion. The flashing red and blue lights of emergency vehicles illuminated the scene as EMTs worked swiftly to extract Adrian from the wreckage. His dark suit was torn, his face pale and smeared with blood. "Possible head trauma," one paramedic called out. "Pulse is steady, but he's unresponsive. Let's move." As they loaded him into the ambulance, Adrian's thoughts flickered, fragmented images of Natasha, the party, and the weight of expectations pulling him in every direction. Then, everything faded into blackness. At Charleston General Hospital, Hannah Clark adjusted her scrabs and pushed a cart down the hallway. A psychiatric nurse with a calm demeanor, she had spent years helping patients navigate their darkest moments. The sound of hurried footsteps and urgent voices pulled her from her routine. She turned her head just in time to see a gurney being wheeled past. Hannah caught a fleeting glimpse of Adrian. His chiseled features, despite their pallor and the blood trickling down his temple, hinted at someone accustomed to control and confidence. Her steps faltered. There was something about him, something unspoken in the way he lay there, silent and broken, that struck her. Hannah shook her head, brushing the thought aside. "Focus on your job," she muttered, moving to her next task. Yet, as she walked away, she couldn't shake the image of Adrian Blackwell, lying so still, his life teetering on the edge. In the quiet break room of Charleston General Hospital, Hannah Clark sat with her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. The day had been long, filled with the usual whirl of patients, consultations, and the quiet chaos of a hospital that never truly slept. Yet her thoughts kept drifting back to the man she'd seen on the gurney earlier, the stranger who had been wheeled past her with such urgency. Another trauma case, she told herself, sipping her tea. Just another face. But it wasn't. Something about him lingered in her mind, the fine material of his torn suit, the sharpness of his features even in their battered state. There was a story there, one she couldn't ignore. Hannah had moved to Charleston 2 years ago, seeking a fresh start after a personal heartbreak. As a psychiatric nurse, she had learned to compartmentalize, to separate her own pain from the struggles of her patients. Still, some cases stayed with her. This man, whoever he was, already felt like one of them. The sterile air of the hospital room felt thick with tension as Natasha Gray entered. Her heels clicked sharply against the linoleum, each step announcing her arrival. She glanced around, her gaze landing on Adrian Blackwell, unconscious and connected to a maze of wires and monitors. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped against her phone as she stood at the foot of his bed. "Adrian?" she said softly, though there was no response. She took a deep breath and pressed a hand to her chest, her tone shifting to one of controlled frustration. "You had to do this today of all days, didn't you?" The room's silence was deafening. Natasha's eyes scanned the machines, as though their steady beeping might offer some reassurance. Her face betrayed no tears, only a flicker of irritation mixed with concern. To her, the situation was as much a disruption as it was a tragedy. She stepped back and pulled out her phone, typing furiously. "The party's canceled," she muttered to herself, sending a message to the event coordinator. "We'll reschedule once this situation is handled." Across the hospital, Hannah Clark cleaned a tray of medical instruments, her mind still wandering back to room 204. She had spent the past hour trying to shake the feeling that had taken root in her chest, but it wouldn't leave. Pausing her work, she let out a sigh and leaned against the counter. She wasn't sure why this particular patient had affected her so much. It wasn't unusual for trauma cases to come through, and yet, am I still thinking about him?" she murmured. A voice behind her broke her thoughts. "Hannah, can you assist in room 204? They need someone to prep for the next shift." Her stomach flipped. "Room 204?" she asked, masking the hesitation in her voice. "Yeah, the car accident guy. His fiancé's in there now," the nurse said, walking off. Hannah swallowed hard but nodded. Taking a deep breath, she gathered her supplies and headed down the hall. When Hannah entered the room, Natasha turned sharply, her eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of her. "Can I help you?" Natasha asked, her tone cool and commanding. "I'm just here to tidy up and restock," Hannah replied, her voice calm but professional. She moved to the supply cabinet, avoiding Natasha's piercing gaze. Natasha crossed her arms, watching Hannah with a mix of curiosity and disdain. "Do you know how long he'll be like this?" she asked, her voice sharp. Hannah hesitated, glancing at Adrian's still form before responding. "It's hard to say. Every case is different." Natasha let out a frustrated sigh. "Of course it is." She turned her attention back to her phone, typing rapidly as though the act itself could regain control over the situation. Hannah finished her task quickly, but before leaving, her gaze lingered on Adrian for just a moment. She couldn't explain why, but she whispered under her breath, "You're not alone." As she exited, Natasha looked up, her brow furrowing. She hadn't caught what Hannah had said, but for a moment her confidence seemed to waver. Her break was interrupted by the sound of urgent voices in the hallway. Standing, Hannah stepped into the corridor just in time to see a nurse rushing toward the trauma unit. "Room 204 admitting now," someone called. Hannah lingered in the hallway, curiosity pulling her closer. Peering around the corner, she saw through the glass of room 204. The man was lying still, hooked up to monitors and surrounded by a flurry of activity. She noticed the faint rise and fall of his chest, a fragile sign of life. Her chest tightened. "Who are you?" she whispered softly, her voice lost in the hum of hospital machinery. Feeling herself, Hannah turned and walked away, her steps purposeful. She had other patients to attend to. But as she pushed her cart down the hallway, the image of the man wouldn't leave her mind. The hospital room had been eerily quiet for days. The only sounds the rhythmic beeping of machines and the occasional murmur of passing nurses. Adrian Blackwell lay motionless, his pale face framed by bandages, his strong features softened by the fragility of his condition. Hannah Clark found herself drawn to room 24 every day. At first, it was just part of her routine, checking vitals, ensuring the room was clean. But as the days passed, something about Adrian compelled her to linger. His stillness seemed to speak of a life interrupted, a man who had once commanded his world, now rendered utterly vulnerable. Hannah began to talk to him, her voice soft and steady. At first, it was little more than casual updates about the weather or the goings-on in the hospital. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwell," she would say, her hand straightening his blanket. "It's sunny today. Maybe when you wake up, you'll see how beautiful it looks from this window." Each day, she replaced the flowers by his bedside. She started with lilies, their white petals a symbol of renewal. But as the week went on, she began bringing different blooms, sunflowers, daisies, even lavender. She would pause, holding the fresh bouquet in her hands, before arranging them in the small vase. "I think these will brighten up your room," she whispered once, placing the lavender on the table. "They say lavender helps with peace of mind. Maybe it'll help you find your way back to us." Over time, Hannah's visits became longer. She spoke to Adrian about her life in Charleston, how she'd moved to the city 2 years ago after leaving behind a difficult chapter of her own. As she sat by his bed, a thought crossed her mind, a memory of the times she herself had felt invisible. "I don't know if you can hear me," she admitted one afternoon, her voice faltering slightly, "but I've always believed that even the smallest gestures matter. Maybe that's why I keep coming back. Maybe because I know what it's like to feel lost." She told him about her favorite books, the calming ritual of making tea after a long shift, and the patients who had touched her heart over the years. "I guess what I'm trying to say," she murmured one evening, her voice barely louder than a whisper, "is that even when life feels impossible, there's always something worth holding on to. You just have to wake up and find it." Adrian's eyes closed briefly as fragments of memory came rushing back. Natasha's calls, the flashing headlights, the sound of screeching metal. His chest tightened, but Hannah's steady presence seemed to keep him from spiraling. Later that day, Natasha arrived, heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. Her expression lit up when she saw Adrian awake, though her relief was tinged with impatience. "Adrian!" she exclaimed, rushing to his side. "Thank God! Do you have any idea how worried I've been?" Her eyes scanned the room, and then her tone shifted, sharp and impatient. "This party fiasco has been a nightmare. But don't worry, I'll fix everything. We'll reschedule and it'll be better than ever." Adrian's gaze flickered to her, confusion clouding his features. "Natasha," he rasped. "Yes, I'm here," she said quickly, cutting him off. "I've been here the whole time. The party was a disaster without you, but that doesn't matter now. What matters is that you're awake and we can move forward." Adrian frowned, her words feeling oddly disconnected from the gravity of the situation. "The party?" "Yes, the engagement party," Natasha said, her tone brisk. "But we'll reschedule. Everyone will understand once they know what happened." Adrian didn't respond, his eyes drifting toward the door where Hannah had quietly entered, carrying a small vase of flowers. She paused, unsure if she should stay, but Adrian's expression softened when he saw her. "Hannah," he said, his voice faint but warm, Natasha turned sharply, her eyes narrowing. "Who's this?" "I'm one of the nurses assigned to Mr. Blackwell," Hannah replied, her tone neutral but polite. She set the flowers on the small table by the bed. "Flowers?" Natasha asked, her voice tinged with annoyance. "How quaint." "They're lilies," Hannah said simply, ignoring Natasha's tone. "I thought they might brighten the room." Adrian's gaze lingered on the flowers, his mind flashing back to moments of warmth and light in the haze of his unconsciousness. "I remember a voice," he murmured. "Someone talking to me." Natasha's expression shifted. "It was probably me," she said quickly, stepping closer. "I've been here every day, Adrian." But Adrian's gaze had already returned to Hannah. "Was it you?" he asked. Hannah hesitated, her cheeks flushing slightly. I spoke to you sometimes," she admitted. "I didn't want you to feel alone." Adrian's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "Thank you," he whispered, his eyes heavy but grateful. Natasha crossed her arms, her irritation barely hidden. "Well, now that you're awake, we can focus on what's important, your recovery and our future." Adrian didn't respond. His gaze remained on Hannah, who stood quietly in the corner, a steady presence in the storm. "Well, thank you for your help, Hannah," Natasha said, her tone clipped. "But I'm here now. I'll handle things from here." Hannah nodded politely, stepping back, but Adrian's voice stopped her. "Wait," he said, his gaze fixed on her. "Stay." Natasha's eyes widened, her composure slipping. "Adrian, she's just a nurse. There's no need—" "She's been here for me," Adrian interrupted, his voice stronger now. "More than anyone else." Natasha froze, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Adrian," she said, her voice trembling with barely concealed frustration, "we've built a life together. You can't just throw that away because of this." Adrian met her gaze, his own steady and resolute. "Natasha, I've been thinking a lot since I woke up. Maybe this accident was a wake-up call. I don't want to go back to a life that was all about appearances and expectations. I need to find out what really matters." Her polished exterior cracked. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I need time," Adrian replied firmly. "Time to figure out who I am and what I want." Natasha stood frozen, her breath hitching as his words settled over her. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the room, the sharp sound of her heels echoing down the hallway. Hannah hesitated near the door, unsure if she should leave. Adrian's voice stopped her once more. "Please, don't go." She turned back, her heart pounding. "Adrian, I don't want to complicate things for you." "You're not," he said, his gaze unwavering. "You've been the only thing keeping me grounded." Hannah's cheeks flushed, but she managed a small smile. "Then I'll stay," she said softly, her voice steady. The tension in the room seemed to ease, replaced by a quiet sense of understanding. For the first time in weeks, Adrian felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that his life, though fractured, might finally be headed in the right direction. A few weeks had passed, and Adrian Blackwell was finally strong enough to take slow, careful walks through the hospital corridors. The once faint memories of the accident were becoming clearer, but the clarity came with new realizations about his life. Anna Clark remained by his side, her presence no longer tied to duty but to a genuine connection that neither of them could deny. Each day, they shared quiet moments filled with meaningful conversations, exchanging thoughts about resilience, loss, and the power of starting over. One evening, as the sun set over Charleston, casting golden light through the hospital windows, Adrian and Hannah found themselves on the terrace outside his room. The air was crisp and cool, carrying with it a sense of renewal. Adrian leaned against the railing, his movements still careful but more confident than before. The crisp evening air carried with it a sense of renewal. He turned to Hannah, his gaze steady. "You know," he began, his voice contemplative, "when I woke up, I thought my life had fallen apart. But maybe it was just falling into place." Anna stood beside him, her arms resting lightly on the railing. "Sometimes it takes losing what we think we want to find what we actually need," she said softly. He turned to her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You've shown me that. I don't think I would have gotten here without you." Henry smiled, her cheeks tinged with a faint blush. "You did all the hard work, Adrian. I just kept reminding you that you weren't alone." For a moment, the two stood in comfortable silence, the world around them quiet and still. "Promise me something," Hannah said, breaking the silence. "Anything," Adrian replied, his voice steady. "Don't stop fighting," she said simply. "For yourself, for the life you deserve." Adrian nodded, his chest swelling with determination. "I won't," he said firmly. "Not ever." As the city lights flickered on in the distance, Adrian and Hannah stood side by side, ready to leave behind the shadows of the past and step into a future built on authenticity, hope, and a bond forged in the unlikeliest of places.